and then David will have about 45 to 50 minutes for his presentation, and then we will have about 10 minutes for questions, and then those of you who have to leave will be able to leave, and then we will proceed with about 15 to 20 minutes of informal discussion. So it's my pleasure and honor to introduce Professor David Shanks. Professor Shanks has published more than 200 research articles, many of them in top journals, including Science, Brain, and PNAS, to mention just a few, but there are many more like Nature, Human Behavior, and much more. David also published numerous books, including the most recent one co-authored with our recent speaker, Ben Newell, which is called Open-Minded. The good news, guys, for all of us, is that it's an open access book, so you can find it on David's website and even read it. Yeah. So now, without further ado, David, the floor is yours, and we are looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks very much for inviting me, and thank you, Efim, on this such an important day. It's your birthday. Give up your time to listen to this talk. I appreciate it.
It's my honor.
So this is work done in collaboration with Adam and a group of extremely bright and able students who've worked with us over a couple of years, Sam, Josefina, Tom, Jonathan. This is very much ongoing work. So, I think we're really looking forward to some feedback from you and suggestions about where we can take this project. So I guess everybody here is probably familiar, I'm sure, is familiar with anchoring, which was discovered, what, about 50 years or so ago. And just so that we're all on the same page, let me describe a very conventional procedure for testing an anchoring effect in a lab study. Here's an example, which I'll call two-step anchoring. Was the World Wide Web invented before or after 1979 or 1999? So if you were a participant in our experiment, you would be given one of those anchors. And so let's suppose you were given the anchor 1979. You decide whether it was invented before or after that. So that's a comparative question. And then you go on to the judgment part, where you estimate in what year the World Wide Web was invented. The correct answer here is 1989. But the almost ubiquitous finding in anchoring studies is that the anchor value has an influence on the estimate that participants make. And to give you an example here, this is an item that I used in an experiment a couple of years ago. And what we found was that the mean estimate was about 1984 after a low anchor and was 1988 after a high anchor. These effects are incredibly robust. There's a recent meta-analysis by Dan Schley and Evan Weingarten, which meta-analyzes hundreds and hundreds of anchoring studies and finds that the effect size is close to 1 for the effect of anchors on estimations. And of course, anchoring has had a massive impact, not only in sort of theoretical research in JDM, but also applied impact, because anchoring effects can be demonstrated in jury decision-making, in medical contexts, in the amount that people are willing to pay for products, or the amount that they estimate a house is worth, credit card repayments, all sorts of real world and substantive domains where anchoring effects seem to occur. And if you, if you look at the literature, you sometimes get the impression that anchoring is completely ubiquitous, that when a number precedes some estimate, you will always get an influence of that number. I think that's an exaggeration, although there's quite a lot of controversy around this. Let me show you another item here. So you're shown an image like this of Studio 97, and you're told that, you know, Studio 97 or Studio 17 is a new restaurant set to open. The above picture was taken from a magazine. Imagine that you're going to dine at this restaurant. Estimate how much you would be willing to pay for a dinner in this restaurant. Now, this, what's called incidental anchoring procedure, was first studied by Critcher and Gilovich quite a while ago. And this is actually one of the items that they used in their study. And they claimed that you even get anchoring in a situation like this. However, subsequent studies by myself and colleagues and others have failed to replicate this. I mean, I personally do not believe that you get anchoring under these conditions. Incidental anchoring was included in one of the many labs replication studies that was led by Richard Klein. And again, there was no anchoring effect there. So, I mean, we could debate the literature on this, but my personal view is that there are situations in which you get anchoring clearly, and there are situations where you don't. So it's quite useful to think about, you know, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for getting anchoring effect. So you might look at these two examples as the sort of extremes of a continuum and say, well, maybe what they're telling us is that you need to have some engagement with the anchor in order to get an anchoring effect. I mean, obviously in the two-step example that I show here, participants have to make, you know, they have to actually respond to the anchor value. They have to say whether they think the correct date is before or after that. So they're engaging with, they're attending to that anchor, whereas of course in the incidental case, they're not. But that would probably be a poor definition of the necessary conditions, because you also get anchoring in various other situations where engagement with the anchor and the informativeness of the anchor becomes progressively lower. So for instance, I mean, this is a one-step anchoring procedure. It's very like the two-step procedure, but in this case, the anchor value is just stated as part of the question. The distance from San Francisco to New York City is longer than 1,500 miles or shorter than 6,000 miles. How far do you think it is? So here the participants don't have to engage deliberately with the anchor. We don't force them to do anything with the anchor value, but you still get extremely robust anchoring in this situation. And of course, as I'm sure you know, you'll all be aware, you will also see anchoring with random numbers, where, you know, at least from the experimenter's perspective, the anchor is not informative. A random number wheel has been spun and generates the number 75 or the number 5,000. What is the length of the River Nile? And as again, I'll show you in some of our experiments, and you know, many others have shown this before, you get quite strong anchoring effects even in a situation like this. And of course, that was famously the demonstration in Tversky and Kahneman's 1974 paper, where they introduced the term anchoring, where they had a roulette wheel and people were judging the number of African countries that are members of the United Nations. So you get anchoring in these cases, and you also get anchoring with implausible anchors, where again, it would seem that the informativeness of the anchor is pretty low. I mean, if I say to you, Da Vinci was born before 1952, in what year was Da Vinci born? It doesn't seem, from the experimenter's point of view, that the anchor is particularly informative, but nonetheless, you get an anchoring effect. So I offer as a sort of principle here. I mean, this is not meant to be a theory of anchoring. This is just an approximation. Anchoring does seem to require some minimal engagement with the anchor. I mean, it seems you need to think that the anchor is somehow relevant to the entity that you're judging. But it doesn't require that the anchor is presented as coming from a relevant or informative source. And that takes us into the obvious question of whether the participant's perception of the anchor and its informativeness and its relevance aligns with the experimenter's interpretation. So just because the experimenter presents a random anchor and assumes that that random number is uninformative, of course, it doesn't mean that the participants are necessarily going to interpret the anchor as being random and uninformative. And Adam and I think, were quite stimulated by a paper published a few years ago by Dietvorst and Simonson, where they have made this point that sometimes participants pay attention to information despite being instructed by the experimenter to ignore that information. So if you believe that there may, in some circumstances, be a mismatch between perception and presentation, then I think that pretty quickly gets you to wondering what are participants thinking about anchors? I mean, what do they understand is the informativeness of the anchor? And that's really what we're trying to do in these studies. We're trying to probe a little bit into the participants' understanding and awareness of the anchor and what its meaning is, and the extent to which they think it's relevant or informative, and the extent to which they think they're conscious of using it to help make their judgments. And it's quite interesting that there's been really very little work done on probing people's introspections about anchors. Two of the best known sort of models of anchoring are selective accessibility and anchoring and adjustment. I mean, I won't go into these, but selective accessibility is a sort of semantic priming viewpoint combined with confirmatory hypothesis testing, whereas anchoring and adjustment says that, you know, you start from the anchor and then you gradually adjust until you get into an interval that you think is plausible for the quantity that you're estimating. You often see these two theories as being put forward as differing, amongst other things, in terms of the extent to which they prompt deliberative or conscious thinking. So selective accessibility with, you know, connecting to lots of ideas about priming and automaticity is thought to be a, you know, unintentional automatic process, whereas anchoring and adjustment is obviously often thought of as being rather more deliberative. So there's a kind of system one, system two perspective taken in quite a lot of the research. But actually, you know, the amount of evidence on people's intuitions or awareness about anchoring is quite minimal. Some studies present participants with questionnaires at the end of an experiment to ask what they, you know, did they deliberately take the anchor into account and so on. But we decided to take a more direct approach and actually set up experiments in which we would probe our participants at the time that they're making their estimates as to what they were thinking about the anchors and about the influence of the anchors on their behavior. By the way, I'm very happy to, I mean, if there's any questions about the procedure or anything like that, very happy to take those as I go along. Yefim, maybe I may not be able to see, so just shout out if somebody has a question.
Don't worry, sure.
Okay. So I'm going to just show you some of the example questions here that we've given to our participants. I'm not going to go through sort of a series of experiments. I'm going to break things down by the different question types. In each of our experiments, we have several different question types, but I'm going to cluster by the different types of questions rather than by the experiments themselves. So if you want to know any sort of details about the experiments, feel free to ask. But basically, we've looked at different ways of probing participants. So let me begin by just reassuring you that, you know, in all of our experiments, we include standard anchoring questions like this, and we get standard anchoring results. So here would be a question: is the number of pairs of shoes sold by Nike last year greater than 350 million or less than 350 million? So this is, I guess this is the high anchor condition. And then for another participant, they would have a low anchor. And then participants in this particular experiment, they move a slider on a scale to make their estimate. We find, you know, when we have these standard anchoring items, we invariably find anchoring effects. So what's shown here is the anchoring effect depending on whether the participant responded greater or less to the initial question. And overall, of course, when people say that they think the quantity is greater than the anchor, then overall they make higher estimates, as you would expect. But what's more interesting is that regardless of whether they say greater than or less than, you get an anchoring effect, higher estimates for the high anchor than for the low anchor. All of the data that I'm going to show you here are standardized measures. So we put the estimates, we Z-transform, we standardize the estimates because, of course, the estimates for each item are on different measurement scales. So this just puts them all on a common scale. Okay, so standard anchoring is pretty straightforward. Here is the first sort of more interesting question that we've asked our participants. Instead of, you know, is the target that you're judging greater or less than the anchor, we asked the participants whether the suggested anchor value is actually a good or a bad piece of information. And in doing this, in framing the question this way, we're basically picking up and replicating a question that was introduced by Schweikert, hence the term here, Schweikert items. This is a paper from a couple of years by Schweikert, Tam, and Brown, which doesn't seem to have been picked up very much in the literature, but we thought that their procedure was quite interesting, and so we included it as a replication here. So participants say whether the anchor is a good or bad estimate. They then estimate the target quantity. And then what we want to look at is what are their estimates as a function of the response that they make to the evaluation question. And what we find here is quite interesting. So you can see that when participants judge the anchor to be a good estimate, they show a normal and quite strong anchoring effect. When they judge it to be a bad estimate, they show no anchoring effect at all. So you get a highly significant interaction here. And participants don't need to make this estimation, this evaluative estimation overtly, because we get the same finding if they make the estimation covertly. And what I mean by that is now we just turn around the order of the estimation and the evaluation. So in this order reverse condition, participants are first given the anchor. They're told that the height of the tallest tree in the world is 50 meters. Then they make their estimation. They estimate how tall the tallest tree in the world is. And then they say whether the anchor is a good or bad estimate. So in this case, at the time they make their own estimation, any evaluation that they've made of the anchor has been covert. and then they make it overtly at the end of the trial. But again, you can see that exactly the same pattern occurs, that the participants show a strong anchoring effect when they judge the anchor to be good, but they show absolutely no anchoring at all when they judge the anchor to be a poor estimate. And so that replicates the basic pattern that Schweikert and colleagues found.
So can I think about, I'm sorry if it's not appropriate now,
No,
but
sure.
can I think about anchoring as a confusion in a sense? So when I'm confused by it, I use it. But when I think that it is just misleading or I understand that it is irrelevant, then I try to ignore it.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't probed exactly what participants interpret good and bad to mean here, but what you say is plausible, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
So let me just show you a couple more examples of the Schweikert effect, this evaluation effect, just to convince you that it's a pretty strong effect, and just to generalize a little bit beyond what Schweikert and colleagues initially reported. So here's an experiment where there was a manipulation here of the granularity of the response scale. So for half the participants, they had a very low granularity scale. I mean, in this case, with this World Wide Web item, the years on the scale are quite spread out. They have 5 points on the scale that they can choose, and their response is restricted to one of those numbers. No, that's not correct. Their response is not restricted to the number, but the number of scale points is limited. Apologies. And then in the bottom case, they have 9 points on the scale. And so they there's a manipulation of the granularity of the scale. Now, the reason that we included this scale granularity was for a different purpose. There's been some research which suggests that this is a kind of way of diagnosing the involvement of the anchoring and adjustment heuristic, and that you get less anchoring with a more granular scale. Now, in actual fact, in this experiment, we didn't see any difference between the scale granularities, but nonetheless, we were able to ask again whether you get anchoring when the anchor is judged to be a good or a bad value. And the pattern of results is, again, confirms what I showed in the previous experiment. You get anchoring in both the top panel here is the low granularity one, and the bottom panel is that more highly granular scale. In both cases, you get anchoring when the anchor is judged to be a good estimate, and you get absolutely no anchoring at all when it's judged to be a bad estimate. And as a final example of this pattern, we had a look at what happens when you give participants seemingly implausible anchors. So here are the stimuli that we used in the experiment. So you can see some of these items. Have a look here, for example, at the at this item about Da Vinci. So Da Vinci was born after 1391. In what year was Da Vinci born? So for different participants, you can have plausible anchors like 1391 and 1689, which are plausible for most participants. But for other participants, the anchors were pretty seemingly implausible, like 1952. And I mean, I suppose what we were speculating here is that, I mean, it seems surprising that you get anchoring effects with these implausible anchors, although there are reports of this in the literature that you do. But it seems like a reasonable hypothesis then to conjecture that you would, really you would only get these anchoring effects from implausible anchors if some of the participants actually believe that the implausible anchor is a useful estimate. I mean, despite what we as experimenters might think, how could anybody find the year 1952 remotely relevant to judging when Leonardo da Vinci was born? Maybe our 20-year-old student participants are a little bit, fuzzy about their history, and they find an anchor like that quite informative.
David, may I ask a question?
Yeah.
So I don't see the leap between these two things. So 1952 is implausible, but the question, if I'm a Bayesian participant, I should ask, what would make the experimenter give me such an implausible estimate?
Right.
So maybe it is informative,
Yeah,
given my beliefs.
You're right. I mean, in this case, we are providing, we're giving, for a participant who's sort of sensitive to the conversational implications of the experiment, they could perfectly reasonably read the anchor as providing information. So one of the follow-up experiments that we're going to do shortly would be to redo this, where the anchor number is randomly generated, where you would expect that conversational implication was a bit weaker. Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, so what happens here? Well, so I'll just show you the data for each of the items just to make a sort of subsidiary point here, which is that the influence of these anchors is quite variable. Actually, this sort of touches on that question that was just asked by Roy. It's quite interesting that you get implausible anchoring effects with some items, but not with others. You can see here that, quite interestingly, the Gandhi item doesn't generate, at least in this experiment, didn't generate an implausible anchoring effect at all. And that's kind of interesting because it's one of the items that people like Musweiler and Strack have used previously in their research. But other items do show quite a strong implausible anchoring effect. What happens then when we look at that, and that this is combining across all of the data, and this is a highly significant overall implausible anchoring effect. What happens when we break it down by the judgment of whether the anchor is a good or bad estimate? Again, you can see that the effect is moderated by those evaluations. Implausible values seem to cause anchoring only when they're judged to be good estimates, and we don't see that pattern with the bad evaluations. So what those findings about anchor evaluations pointed us to is, let me describe this as no more than a toy model, or a straw man model, if you like. An incredibly simple framework for thinking about the role of awareness and intention in anchoring effects. So what I've shown so far is that some sort of evaluation of the anchor as being either good or bad seems to be associated with whether you obtain an anchoring effect or not, ultimately. But there has to be a stage in between the evaluation of the anchor and its impact on behavior. And in particular, you would have to assume that in here, there is some sort of conscious or intentional process whereby the participant says, well, that seems to be a bad estimate. Therefore, I should not use it. And therefore I intend not to use it. And so in the remaining experiments that I want to tell you about, we're going to be looking at this sort of intermediate stage here, motivated, as I mentioned earlier, by these sort of ideas by Dietvorst and Simonson, to see whether, as we expect, these evaluations of the anchors as good or bad translates into conscious intentions to either use or not use the anchor when it's judged to be a bad estimate. So as a first attempt to do this, we set the question up like this. We asked people to make estimates about another person's behavior. And the reason for doing it about a third person is perhaps just to get at the idea of wanting people's target here to be about precision. How accurately can you estimate somebody else's behavior? And so we frame the question like this. Freddie has been asked, what is the length of the River Nile? Your task is to estimate Freddie's answer. Additional information. The length of the River Nile is less than 5,000 kilometers. So this is the anchor, and obviously for another participant, the anchor would be a low value. And then we asked, I mean, the main point of this experiment is we ask participants whether they actually want to take into account that anchoring information to help them estimate Freddie's judgment. So we asked them, would taking into account the additional information make you worse or better at estimating Freddie's answer? And then finally, participants estimate Freddie's response to the question, what is the length of the River Nile? And we find a couple of interesting things here. First of all, I mean, we get an anchoring effect. So people's estimate of Freddie's response is sensitive to the anchor. But what's more interesting is that an overwhelming percentage of participants told us that they thought that taking the anchor into account would help them make their own judgment about Freddie's estimate. So that's telling us that that people in a normal anchoring situation do indeed believe that the anchor information is useful and informative. So we've now sort of gone on to frame this kind of question in a few different ways to probe some slightly different aspects of people's intentions about using an anchor. Here's another example then. This is an example where we get away from estimating somebody else's behavior, and we also now switch to the situation where the anchor is described as being randomly generated and therefore as being uninformative. A number wheel has been randomly spun and generates the number 150 or 1,000. Is the distance from London to Paris longer or shorter than 150 or 1,000 kilometers? Now, I mean, in the example that I just showed you, the majority of people indicated that they wanted to, that they thought that taking account of the anchor information would help them. What will they do here when the anchor is now described quite explicitly as being randomly generated? And you might predict that, well, surely people will say, no, in this case, I don't want to base my judgment. I don't want to take any account of the anchor number.
All right, David. So may I ask again here? So, they know the distribution on the wheel?
The distribution of the anchor?
No, of the numbers available on the wheel. Because if they don't, then this is informative.
I mean, they see what you see here.
Right. So it is plausible that the numbers you chose to put on the wheel before you span it are informative. And this gives me some information about what kind of numbers you
which
put on the wheel.
Which could explain why you have 54% saying yes, right?
Yeah, you're right. No, yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're right.
Right. And they are right. They are correct.
Yeah.
I mean, given their beliefs.
Yeah. I mean, perhaps less informative than in the previous case, but even so, I mean, so the point here isn't about, isn't really about whether people genuinely believe that the anchor is uninformative. It's just corroborating that, even in the situations that we set up quite frequently in these experiments, this is a procedure that's used quite frequently. People are just told, here's a number generated at random. Even in those situations, many of the participants believe that it would be informative to take the anchor value into account. And then, of course, they make their estimate, and what we find here is both an anchoring effect, but also an attenuation of the anchoring effect in those cases where the participants say that they would not want to take the anchor into account. Okay, so there's a significant interaction here. You do get an anchoring effect when the participants respond no, but it's significantly smaller than in the case where they say yes. And here's another instance where, I mean, it's similar to that one there, but in this case, the we get rid of this is just a one-step situation rather than a two-step situation. So it makes it kind of even simpler. Your task is to estimate the length of the River Nile in kilometers. A random number wheel has been spun and generates the number 5,000. Would you use that number to help you make your estimate? Yes or no? And then participants make their estimate. And again, what we find is an attenuation of the anchoring effect when participants say no. And in this case, about 40% of participants reported that they would want to take the anchor into account. And then just as this is my final example, instead of looking at attention, we look at participants' awareness. So now we ask people explicitly whether they took the anchor into account in making their judgment. So a number wheel has been randomly spun and generates the number 50. Is the number of people using Instagram each day greater or less than 50 million? So participants make that estimate, and then we ask them, did you use the generated number to help you estimate how many people, et cetera, et cetera? So this is a direct sort of awareness question. Here we find, again, a large proportion of people report yes, that they did use the anchor. And again, we get this significant attenuation of the anchoring effect. So I'm just going to wrap up with a final discussion, and then happy to take any questions. So coming back to this sort of toy model here, what we find is that the anchoring effect is eliminated when participants judge that the anchor is a bad estimate. It's not eliminated, but it is at the very least significantly attenuated when they tell us here about their intention or their awareness of using the anchor. Now, I mean, the fact that it's only attenuated and not eliminated, what do we make of that? I mean, you could say, all right, well, the fact that it's only attenuated is a sort of falsification of this model. We don't, I don't want to put this up as a strong model, and it is possible that that the model is wrong, albeit it does capture some essence of factors that moderate the anchoring effect. On the other hand, I mean, it may be that this is the fact that the effect is only attenuated and not eliminated. It is little more than a kind of consequence of, is an artifact of the procedure here. I mean, as we discussed, as came up in that question, the participants may not, may think that there's still something informative about the anchor. There may be a purely a judgment thing here. I mean, we're asking people to make a binary response, yes, no, and they may, so they have to sort of place a threshold on where they draw the line between reporting that they used or didn't use the anchor, and they may report that they didn't use it, even in cases where they're somewhat aware that they made a little bit of use of it. So it may just be a sort of procedural artifact. And that's one of the things that we have to investigate in further research. But just to sum up, I think that the anchoring effect is sensitive to metacognitive reports. Anchoring isn't inevitable. It does not entirely occur automatically or outside of awareness. And the perceived informational value of the anchor is, at the very least, a moderator of the anchoring effects. So I'll finish there. I hope that was in good time to leave an opportunity for some questions.
Yes, definitely. And I already see that Kinneret has a question.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much for this talk. I wanted to suggest two things. If you go back to your diagram with the general model. So one thing is that it might be, and it relates to what Roy just said. So one thing might be that sometimes anchors are informatives. So you might be overgeneralizing. So even if you go to the bottom line, you can still have some kind of traces of the general heuristics of rely on the anchor, which could be effective in many, many cases, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing is the second option that I think you talked less about, is that you might decide that I should not use the anchor, like I should not think of a white bear or things like that. So you don't want to do that, but you're still influenced from it. And it might be from the same, I don't know, from the same driver of kind of overgeneralization. And I think, I don't know, I think that you might be able to know more about that. We might be able to, if we give them some feedback and check over time.
Yeah.
And so the next question is whether you tried that, to give them some feedback.
No, we haven't tried giving them feedback. I mean, I think that case really gets at a substantive issue here. So, I mean, if the participants want to ignore the anchor, try to ignore it, but nonetheless can't help being influenced by the anchor, that's kind of interesting. I mean, that is getting at a sort of automatic impact of an anchor. But it may be that, it's quite hard to distinguish between that and a situation where their report about their use of the anchor is just a not very sensitive or very accurate report. I mean, we have decades of knowledge, don't we, going back to Erickson and Simon and many others, that people are not always particularly precise in reporting on their own states of awareness. The way that you elicit those reports matters. So it's quite a delicate issue distinguishing, I think, between those two cases. But you're right. There's probably quite a lot going on here that we need to probe in this project.
Elliot?
Thanks. Hi, David. Great talk.
Thank you.
Very much enjoyed. I had a question related to, I guess, anchoring in different areas, and I'm not sure how you would translate that. So, I believe, if I followed right, all the examples you used, there was a correct answer, and people were trying to get at it, in different ways, using perhaps using the anchors. But the question is, what happens if you're anchoring on price or something like that, where there isn't actually a correct answer? Do you think the same sorts of things would hold? And how would it work in terms of there being a good or a bad estimate of price or something like that?
Yeah. No, that's a great question, Elliot. We haven't really looked at price estimations in these. I mean, we've done some experiments on willingness to pay. I mean, clearly, you get huge anchoring effects there. Just trying to remember. No, I don't think we've done that with. But actually, my speculation is that it would be exactly the same. I mean, it
seems like a different judgment. It's a harder judgment of what's a good and a plausible and a bad, right? In a price case than when there's a true answer that you might be getting.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, I think, obviously the default from our point of view would be probably the same thing that would be moderated by an anchor and the evaluation and your attention. But absolutely, that's something we need to check.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Stefan? I hope I pronounce your name correctly.
Yeah. Do you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, so I wonder whether you have a reason to believe that it isn't that just there's a selection effect, basically being that those who are, for instance, whose answer would be low, and they are given a high anchor, they are more likely to say that the anchor is a bad estimate.
Yeah.
So they might still be anchored.
Yeah.
But because to begin with, their idea about the target attribute is that it's going to be low, and they are more likely to say that it's a bad estimate, and vice versa for low anchor.
Yeah. No, that's completely right. That there is a potential of a selection effect in here. I mean, that selection effect doesn't really explain why, as far as we can tell, when participants judge the anchor to be bad, you literally get no anchoring at all. I mean, this is most clearly evident here. I mean, it's not just that the effect is attenuated, or it doesn't even become an anti-anchoring effect, which I think it could do logically on that selection account. It really just seems to be completely eliminated. But I do take the point that there is potential for selection here. And so one of the things that we're going to do, I think that we probably need to do, is get participants, first of all, to give us their unanchored estimates for a whole range of quantities, and then get them to come back maybe a week later and put them through the evaluation experiment, so we can look at their own estimates to see whether they show an anchoring effect. And I think that will test that sort of selection
But
mechanism.
they have their previous estimation is kind of another anchor, which will compete with the anchor that you give them, right?
Maybe, yeah. That's why we would maybe have a delay of a week or so. Stepan, would that sort of procedure test the selection account adequately, do you think?
What is it again?
I get part of them to come in, and I get them to give me unanchored estimates for 50 quantities, and then they come back a week later and they make the same estimates in the presence of low or high anchors for which they're giving us evaluations. So on the selection account, if I understand it rightly, on the selection account, I should still see anchoring, even when I compare a person's judgment under a bad anchor to their own unanchored estimate.
Yeah, that might be a possible. So I think the problem with that, you would have to have that both groups would have the same average estimate before the anchor. That is, both groups, meaning those who say that the anchor seems a good estimate and bad estimate, which I think that is unlikely.
No, what I can do is I can compare your estimate of the length of the River Nile when you're given a high anchor that you judge to be bad. I can compare that estimate with your own unanchored estimate.
Yeah, I get that. I think that there might be some problem with regression to the mean, but I'm not sure exactly how that would work in this case. So I would have to think about it more, whether that works.
Yeah, I mean, so there are other. I mean, obviously there are other ways of coming at this. I mean, Adam, I think, is interested in situations where we actually manipulate people's intentions, and there are some studies. I think there's a study published quite recently by Berg and Moss, where they instructed participants to ignore the anchor, and they found that they were able to do so. So if you have an experimental manipulation of intention, that's perhaps a bit stronger as well.
Also, I think that the problem with eliciting the answer before might be that it might eliminate the anchoring effect just because people are using the answer that they remember. Yeah. Because it seems that people are quite consistent in, like, you can see anchoring effect in after a couple of weeks. right?
Yeah,
There's
yeah,
there's
yeah, yeah,
there's
yeah.
some evidence for that, and even like presenting anchor, not eliciting the absolute judgment, and after a couple of weeks, if you ask for the absolute judgment, you still see anchoring effect. And so there might be a problem that people sort of know or somehow remember what they thought about, or even the estimate itself.
Yeah. Well, we'd be able to see
proceed.
whether we got a normal anchoring effect, but I take the point. Yeah, yeah.
I guess it's me now, right?
Yes, no, it's you.
Okay, thanks. I'm not allowed to say that I enjoyed your talk. Peter doesn't allow that. But let me say why I think it's related to the decision from experience literature, or at least the way I understand this literature and the current group. I think one of the reasons why the study of decision from experience is interesting, because in real life, it's very rare that when you get a description of something, you should believe it. For example, when I was recently in the airport, not so recently actually, and the security person say you randomly was selected to be checked. And I did not think this was randomly. You know, they told me this is a random selection, and I thought, no, I'm probably because I'm from the Middle East and I look, well, I took it
You look suspicious.
Yeah, I took it as a good thing that I still look like a terrorist. So I think that basically the reason why I study decision from, and I think your results support that when there was a good reason to assume, like in the restaurant example, when there was a good reason to assume that this is really unrelated, it was not related. But when you explicitly was told that it's unrelated, but there was a good reason to assume that it is, as Roy said, then people take it into account. And this is, I think, the main reason why the study of decision from experience is important, because mainstream decision research that focus on decision from description and rest on the crazy working assumption that the subject believe everything you tell them, I think this is really a bad working assumption. It was very useful in the 70s when the goal was to reject rational economic theory under the strong working assumption that people believe everything you tell them. But now that we understand that there is that subjects in the lab are not stupid, they are just like us in real life.
Yeah.
That everything we are being told we doubt, and then if you really want to have model of human behavior, you have to take that. Don't assume that people believe everything, and this is really nice, demonstrating that probably that the anchoring effect with random number generator is because the subject don't believe it.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And it does suggest maybe an interesting program where, you know, you incorporate feedback and you try to set up situations where, you know, in some incentivized situation where there's a correct answer, where, you know, maybe where people can learn to pay less and less attention to an anchor, if that helps them to improve over a series of trials with feedback, if that helps them to improve their estimations.
Yeah. By the way, this is related to another line of research that I'm involved too, that I'm sure that you can get to, you know, think about the contrast effect. The contrast effect is a reverse anchoring effect, right? And of course, there are many situations when you do get contrast effect.
Yeah.
So I'm sure, and the reason why you get contrast effect is because subjects come to the lab in some settings with a belief that a contrast effect will help them maximize. You know, if someone selected left, I should select right. So I believe that you're correct. If you create a situation in which it's good to exhibit the contrast effect, you get contrast effect. It is interesting that in some situations, subjects come with a feeling that anchoring or assimilation effect is optimal. In other situations, they come up with a feeling that a contrast effect is optimal.
Yeah, it would be interesting to say, you probably know that, I mean, Nick Chater has looked at contrast versus assimilation effects, whether that's an explanation for the patterns that they find.
Yeah.
May add one aside, if I may. The point about participants might not believe everything we tell them, and in this instance, they certainly shouldn't. I mean, you know, even in the anchoring studies where they roll a dice ostensibly in front of them, this is a weighted dice. So actually, the participants are quite right in disbelieving these are random because they're not.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even Tversky and Kahneman might have, unwittingly been responsible for this. They give a very minimal description of how they generated the anchors with the roulette wheel, but it's quite possible that their participants thought there was something rigged, about that.
Yeah, but Roy also said that even if it's absolutely random, they selected the roulette. So
sure. Yeah. Sure.
Thank you, Ido. It's interesting.
It may be good that economists or something. Economists are very strong on non-deception. So maybe you psychologist guys have the problem more than we economists.
Yeah.
Priya,
So,
I hope I pronounce your name correctly.
Yeah, that is fine. Thank you. Professor Shanks, very good. I mean, it was a very interesting talk. I have a question around the first part. I put the same in the chat as well. That is, the anchor seems a good estimate or anchor seems a bad estimate. To decide that, to say that the anchor is good or bad, I have to compare it with something. There should be an internal comparison happening. Otherwise, how can I say it is good or bad? So what is that? Because if that comparison is happening, then that means I have an estimate already. That is, so it's a bit going in a loop.
Yeah, I mean, participants must have some information. Maybe, maybe they retrieve instances from memory of, or information. They retrieve information from memory that is relevant to making an estimation. And as they start to retrieve that information from memory, they then think about the anchor and whether the anchor is aligned with the information that they're retrieving from memory. And as you say, I mean, it's probably an iterative process, but yeah, somehow or other there is an interaction between the anchor and that iterative generation process by which information that's relevant to the estimation is being accessed. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Stefan?
Yeah, so just to know that it's possible to use sort of a procedure where you have take 3 digits, last digits from your social security number or mobile phone number or something like that and use that as an anchor. So there it's clear that it cannot be connected in any way to the judgment, and there anchoring was shown even with this procedure.
Yeah.
So that's something that's possible to use where people probably wouldn't worry about that or wouldn't think that it's somehow connected to the question.
Yeah, but I mean, what would your prediction be if we asked participants whether they want to include that information in their estimate? It wouldn't surprise me if a reasonable number of people reported that they would, for whatever reason.
Also, by the way, there was a TV show in Israel attacking Dan Ariely, and one of the things they did in that show is try to replicate these results for some reason, thinking this is Dan Ariely results, and they failed to replicate.
Among others,
I think
that there was someone else who did that, who used that.
Yeah.
I think that there's this one unpublished paper which shows that basically the more clear it is that the number is randomly generated, the less of an anchoring you have.
Yeah.
And so I think that maybe this would be something where you would see less anchoring and people would probably say less that they would use it somehow. I mean, you have there some residual information in terms of that it should be that the answer will be something in between, for instance, 0 and 1000 if it's like 3 digits. So there is still some information. So people can say, yeah, I'm gonna use that as an information because it tells me the ranges where I should expect the answer. But probably apart from that, I would say that probably more people would say that they wouldn't use it. But yeah. That's my guess. It might be an interesting study.
Yeah, I mean, you might have seen there was an interesting paper published in PNAS a couple of weeks ago by Ong Choko and colleagues, where they showed anchoring from a captcha. You know what I mean by a captcha is when, you go onto a website and it has a little security thing where it shows you a number and you have to type it in. And usually the number is a bit difficult to read. And they show strong anchoring effects from captures, which is a bit like, I think, a bit like the Social Security case. What they found that was even more remarkable was that between completing the capture and making your estimate, if you walk through a doorway, you completely eliminate the anchoring effect.
I think that one is different because they were not asked to somehow, well, it was not connected to the absolute judgment in any way, I think. It was sort of incidental anchors, so that would be what you, among others, I think, argued that.
No, but people had to type the anchor in. I mean, it's not quite the same.
Right. So they were made aware of it, but it was not connected in any way to the judgment at hand, right?
Correct.
Which
Correct.
they showed.
Correct.
And so,
but we know that from lots of research that if the anchor information is about a different dimension to the entity that you're estimating, you still get anchoring effects.
Just checking something in the background because I thought I was right. So that Social Security number, Chapman and Johnson looked at this and they asked, and 34% of participants still said they thought the experimenter wanted that number to be informative and to use it as part of their judgments.
Yeah,
so even for the Social Security number. So it just shows how much, and a lot of that, of course, is potentially demand characteristics to some degree. It's like, we think you want us to do it, so we will.
Ido's point is completely right, I'm sure.
So unfortunately, our time is running up. So those who have to leave can leave now, and we will thank David again for the excellent presentation. But those who can stay are invited to stay for a few more minutes, and we'll continue the discussion. Saida.
Hi. I was just thinking maybe we could manipulate the importance for the people and then check the results, because I think the importance would affect the deliberate decision to take into account the anchor or not.
So
just
have you got an idea of
suggestion?
No, thank you. It's a nice suggestion. Have you got an idea of, how you would do that? What do you mean by the importance?
For example, I mean, in one group, you would incentivize people. I mean, saying that, I mean, you would pay some amounts when they are accurate, for example, but for another group, you wouldn't do that.
So, that's a good, I mean, and incentives do, I mean, Adam will correct me if I'm wrong, I think incentives do reduce anchoring effect a little bit. Not completely, but they do. And we could, it would be quite interesting to build that into this kind of task as well. Yeah, thank you.
Oli.
Yeah, thanks. So David, I'm not sure, you mentioned that PNAS paper about the CAPTCHA anchors. So do you trust this result? So it seems like this should not be operating as an anchor according to everything we just heard.
No, I'm not sure. I mean, I mean, we know that you get anchoring effects from random anchors. We know that you get anchoring effects even when the anchor is so if I say the length of the height of the Brandenburg gate is such and such, and then ask people to estimate the width of the Brandenburg gate, or even more extreme differences than that, when the anchor is on a scale or a dimension that's really different from what you're estimating, you do still get anchoring effects. So it's not completely implausible to me that you get an anchoring effect from a capture. What seems really, really implausible is that whether or not you walk through a doorway attenuates that. That seems pretty flaky, to be honest.
But it's part of the same idea of the context. Like the captcha is kind of part of the context that you should ignore, and you do not ignore that. It's like, again, it's like this kind of error. I don't want to be influenced by it, but it's in my context and I cannot somehow do that. Maybe the door is kind of
yeah. It's possible. I mean, we may try to replicate that, but we'll see.
Okay, thanks.
Roy, it's your third question, but don't expect an ice cream from us. Go ahead.
Well, next time I visit, well, bring it up. I'm curious about the selection. So I think what you're suggesting is that when people say it's a bad estimate, you should see counter anchoring if it's selection, right? Because
that's right. You could do, yeah. In an extreme case.
One thing that could be interesting is ask them how good is the estimate, then the same as you did, and then ask them how good is the estimate, the alternative estimate. So if you ask them for the low one, after they give you the point estimate, give them the high estimate, ask them how good it is, and then try to redo the analysis, but in like a reverse chronology. And if it's only selection, you will get exactly the same pattern, right?
Not quite sure.
Well, assuming that it's independent.
So one of the things that we might do, so instead of just asking good, bad, you could say good, bad, very bad, really, really bad, really, really good, you know. And so I think the selection account says that, you know, you should, at some point, you should see an anti-anchoring effect. If people only say it's a really, 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 really bad estimate, when their own unanchored estimate is extremely different from the anchor in distributional terms, and then you should see an anti-anchoring effect. I wasn't quite sure I understood what you were suggesting about.
So what you're saying, the anchoring effect is the when you give people the estimate, you conjecture that it affects their estimate, their answer after that, right?
Yeah.
And the selection story is that once you divide them according to how they estimate the estimate, you create different groups, and that creates the difference between the groups in the estimate they give you. Saying if selection is what's going on, then you could ask them first to give the estimate, their own freely given estimate, then tell them, here is an estimate from someone else, how good it is, and then run the same story. Anchoring shouldn't happen here because they see the anchor after they've given you their answer, their point estimate. But the selection is going to work in the same way.
Okay.
That's a good.
Okay, thank you. That's a nice idea. Yeah. If we turn it around the other way, we should be able to see whether there's a selection without anchoring. I think I understand that. Yeah.
And another thing you might do is manipulate whether it's a good estimate or bad estimate by providing the source. Say, this is an estimate from a history student.
Yeah, I mean, but that's going to be a variation of the informativeness as well. But yeah, I think there's lots of ways of getting at these things, but thank you. Thank you, yeah.
Here is a related question. Maybe it was already even asked and I missed it. But basically, anchoring is related to the level of expertise, right? Because whatever anchor you give me, if I know when the World War II started, hopefully I will still give you the right answer. And again, related to what Ido said before, so if even I'm a naive participant, but I have learning, then the effect of anchoring should disappear within time, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what the meta-analyses show, is that anchoring is reduced in experts, not by very much, but that depends. I mean, in these experiments, they're probably not varying expertise on a particularly wide dimension. Yeah, but I agree. I think, you know, I think the conversational, you know, the demand characteristics of these tasks are quite considerable. Yeah.
I still have I have another thought about those weird guys that say that they want to use this the last digit of the, I don't know, social security number as an anchor. And I'm just thinking maybe this kind of characteristic or tendency is correlated with pattern seeking that we find in our studies, that people sometimes look for patterns when they do not exist. So I'm just thinking aloud that might be that this is part of the trying to think about a pattern that we don't see. So for us, it seems like maybe a weird answer, but there is something that the world gave me this anchor, like specifically here, because it might tell me something.
I agree. There's probably some individual differences, correlates of these things. And I would bet you that if we ask some of our participants, say our participants go in and they maybe make 12 or 20 estimates for different quantities, I would bet quite a lot of money that some of them believe there's a rule, there's some sort of hidden, the experimenter has got some hidden rule by which the anchor on one trial relates to the anchor on the next trial, for sure.
So the comment about just a quick about what Ido said before, that there is evidence on deviation from Bayesianism, that once you model how much the participants believe what you tell them, then they get very close to Bayesian, if you incorporate that as part of the Bayesian model. So you can model that as well.
So can I think about it as a description experience gap in a sense? So if I get only a descriptive question about with an anchor, my behavior will be very different than if I have the same question but I get experience. So I have the same question with the feedback and the opportunity to learn.
I'm not sure it's a gap. I think this is it. This is the decision from experience. The decision from experience logic suggests that when you come to a lab, based on your past experience, you will exhibit in many situations the anchoring effect, but in some situations you exhibit the opposite. And then you see the contrast effect.
Okay, unless we have any additional questions, I want to thank you, David, again for this excellent talk and productive conversation. I think this is the most questions that we got so far for a single talk.
Well, that's either a good or a bad sign. I'm not sure.
No, it's definitely a good sign, because it means that people understood what you were talking about. Even I was able to understand.
I say that given the previous talk by Dan Goldstein, David had dots in all of his graphs. So that's why we understood it so well.
He listened carefully. Okay, so thank you so much. And we hope to see you all in our next meeting next month.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye.